Walter Grayson didn't knock. He walked into Lila Harper's supply station like he owned it, because in his mind, he already did. He set a leather satchel on her counter, unclipped the brass buckle with 2 fingers, and pulled out a document thick enough to choke on. Didn't say good morning, didn't ask her name, even though he'd ridden 2 days to find her specifically. "Sign this," he said. "You'll have a week to settle your affairs." Lila looked at the paper, then at him. "I don't know what this is." "It's a marriage contract." He said it the way a man announces the weather. "You come highly recommended. I need a capable woman, not a pretty one. You qualify." Not a pretty one, in front of a store full of customers. The room went absolutely still. If you've ever been spoken to like you were furniture, like your entire worth was a line item on someone's ledger, hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. Drop your city and country in the comments so I can see how far this tale has traveled. And don't you dare leave before the end, because what Lila Harper does next will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The supply station at the edge of Dust Creek wasn't much to look at. 3 narrow aisles of dry goods, a wall of tools and hardware, a hand-painted sign above the door that read, Harper's, Estant, 1879, and behind the worn pine counter, Lila herself. 34 years old, brown hair pinned back without vanity, hands that knew work the way most women knew prayers, quietly, constantly, without expecting thanks. She had run the station alone for 6 years. Before that, she'd run it alongside her father until his lungs gave out from the dust and the winters and the years. He left her the building, the debt attached to it, and a customer ledger written in handwriting so cramped she'd spent 3 weeks just learning to read it. She paid off the debt in 4 years. Nobody helped her do that. The people of Dust Creek had come to rely on her the way they relied on the well in the center of town, without much thought, and only with great alarm when she wasn't there. She knew which families ran short before payday and quietly extended credit without making anyone feel small about it. She knew which ranchers were honest and which ones padded their orders hoping she wouldn't catch the arithmetic. She always caught the arithmetic. What the town didn't know, what Lila had never told a single living soul, was that she had been in love with the same man for the better part of a decade. Jonah Pike. He wasn't rich. He wasn't polished. He worked a small spread 3 miles outside town, running about 40 head of cattle on land that was more rock than grass, doing the kind of work that left a man's hands cracked and his back crooked before 50. He came into Harper's Supply every week, sometimes twice. He always bought the same things: salt, coffee, a spool of wire when he had it in the budget. He always paid cash, always exact, and he always found some reason to stay a few minutes longer than the transaction required. He'd ask about her inventory. He'd comment on the weather. He'd lean against the counter with his hat in his hands and talk about nothing in particular, and Lila would answer him and keep her face entirely neutral and feel her heart doing something embarrassing in her chest. She had never told him. She had decided years ago that she was not the kind of woman men like Jonah Pike looked at that way. She was useful. She was dependable. She was the woman who knew where everything was and how much it cost and whether you could afford it. That was its own kind of worth, she had taught herself to believe. It was enough. It was not enough. The morning Walter Grayson arrived in Dust Creek, Lila was reconciling her October accounts. She had 3 discrepancies she couldn't explain and a headache building behind her left eye. And the last thing she was prepared for was the door swinging open with the kind of authority that made everyone in the room look up. Walter Grayson was 51 years old and built like a man who had spent 30 of those years outdoors and the other 20 giving orders from a leather chair. He wore good clothes, not showy, but unmistakably expensive. His boots were the kind that cost more than most men in Dust Creek made in a month. He had a mustache trimmed to precision and eyes that moved around a room the way a man appraises a horse at auction, noting structure, looking for flaws, assigning value. He walked straight to the counter. He didn't browse. He didn't look at the shelves. He set down his leather satchel and pulled out the document and said what he said. "Sign this. You'll have a week to settle your affairs." Lila set down her pen. "I don't know what this is." "It's a marriage contract. You come highly recommended. I need a capable woman, not a pretty one. You qualify." Old Clarence Rutherford was standing not 6 feet away, holding a tin of tobacco, and he forgot to close his mouth. Margaret Howell, who had come in for thread, pressed herself into the nearest shelf and watched with wide eyes. 2 young ranch hands near the back went completely still. Lila looked at the document on her counter. Then she looked at Walter Grayson. "I'm going to need you to back up," she said, "and start again." Something shifted in his expression. Not embarrassment exactly, but the mild recalibration of a man who wasn't accustomed to being redirected. He took one small step back. Whether he intended it as compliance or merely a tactical adjustment, she couldn't tell. "My name is Walter Grayson," he said. "I run the largest cattle operation in the Harlow Valley. I have 4,000 acres, 230 head, a crew of 18, and a house that requires management I don't have time to provide. I was advised by 3 separate people in this region that you are organized, financially competent, and capable of running a complex operation under pressure. I need a partner in the practical sense. I'm offering you a legal arrangement that provides security, a home, and a stake in a profitable enterprise." "Who told you about me?" "Jim Calloway. Earl Briggs, the circuit judge who passes through here every November." All people she knew. All people she had helped over the years with one thing or another. She felt a strange sensation in her chest, something between being seen and being catalogued. "I don't know you," Lila said. "No, but I know your reputation, and it's a better foundation than most marriages start with." Clarence Rutherford had still not closed his mouth. "This isn't really the place for this conversation," Lila said evenly. "I have 2 days in Dust Creek before I need to return to the valley. I'd rather not waste either of them." She looked at him for a long moment. He had the steady, unembarrassed stare of a man who had decided what he wanted and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. There was something almost refreshing about it, in the way a slap to the face can be briefly clarifying. "Come back at closing time," she said. 6 o'clock. He picked up the document, returned it to his satchel, and nodded. Then he walked back out, and the door swung shut behind him, and for a good 3 seconds nobody in the store moved. Then Clarence said, "Well, I'll be damned." "Don't repeat that, Clarence," Lila said, and picked up her pen and went back to her accounts. She didn't find the 3 discrepancies that morning. She couldn't concentrate enough to find anything. Word got around Dust Creek with the speed that only small towns can manage, the kind of speed that has nothing to do with horses or telegraph, and everything to do with human nature's absolute inability to keep quiet about other people's business. By noon, Lila had received 4 separate visitors who didn't need a single thing from her store. By 2 o'clock, Ruth Heller had come in under the pretense of buying baking soda to tell Lila that Walter Grayson was quite striking for a man his age, which was Ruth's way of saying she approved without wanting to seem like she was influencing anything. By 4 o'clock, Lila's friend May Dunbar showed up and dispensed entirely with pretense. "Tell me everything," May said, dropping both elbows on the counter. "There's nothing to tell." Lila. The man proposed marriage in front of half the town before 9 in the morning. There is absolutely everything to tell. It wasn't a proposal. It was a business proposition. Lila capped her ink bottle. "He wants someone who can run a household and manage accounts. He said so directly." "And you said?" "I told him to come back at 6. May stared at her. "You didn't say no." "I didn't say yes either." "Lila Harper, do you understand what 4,000 acres means?" "I understand what it means. I also understand that I don't know this man from a fence post." May was quiet for a moment, which for May was unusual. Then she said more carefully, "What does Jonah think?" Lila's hands stopped moving on the counter, just for a second. "Jonah doesn't have thoughts about my personal life, May. He's a customer. He's in here twice a week. He buys supplies twice a week. He stayed an hour and a half last Tuesday. We were discussing the price of wire." May looked at her with the specific, exhausted expression of a woman who has been friends with another woman for a very long time. "For an hour and a half. Wire prices are complicated right now." May pushed off the counter. "You know what your problem is? You're so used to keeping the books balanced that you can't stand to write anything down until you're certain of the number. Lila didn't answer that, mostly because it was uncomfortably accurate. Walter Grayson comes with a known number, May said, at the door. Just think about what you're comparing it to. She left, and Lila stood alone in the quiet store and tried very hard not to think about Jonah Pike standing right where May had been standing, hat in hands, talking about wire prices that neither of them cared about. Walter came back at 6 exactly. Lila had closed the shutters and sent the last customer out and was standing behind the counter when he came through the door. He'd changed into a cleaner shirt. He sat down in the chair she pointed to, the one across from her small desk in the corner, and he set the satchel down and didn't immediately open it. I came on abruptly this morning, he said. Yes, you did. I'm not good at approach. I can see a thing clearly, decide it's what I need, and then move toward it without much ceremony. My first wife told me the same thing, more than once. Lila hadn't known there was a first wife. What happened to her? Fever, 7 years ago. He said it without self-pity. We had a good arrangement. I respected her. She kept the household together through lean years that would have broken other women. He paused. I'm not looking to replace her. I understand people aren't replaceable. I'm looking for someone who could build something with me. Lila studied him. There was something in how he spoke about his late wife that settled her slightly. Not the absence of grief exactly, but the presence of honesty. He hadn't claimed to be heartbroken to win her sympathy, and he hadn't dismissed the woman either. Tell me about the operation, Lila said. He did. He talked for 40 minutes, and Lila asked questions, and he answered them directly, and she asked harder questions, and he answered those too. He had debt, but it was structured debt on expanding infrastructure, not the desperate kind. His crew had low turnover, which told her something about how he ran things. His books showed consistent growth across 6 years. He wasn't exaggerating. She would have spotted exaggeration. When he was done, he said, Well, I need to think about it. That's fair? He stood. I leave day after tomorrow. I'll need your answer by then. You'll have it. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, Miss Harper, this morning wasn't meant as an insult. The way I said it was poorly done. But I meant what I said about your capabilities. I don't offer things I don't mean. After he left, Lila sat in the quiet store for a long time. She pulled out a blank sheet of paper. She drew a line down the center. On one side, she wrote the word Grayson. On the other side, she wrote nothing at all, just stared at the blank half of the page. After a while, she folded it up and put it in her pocket and went to close up the back room. She saw Jonah the next morning. He came in earlier than usual. She heard the door at just past 7:30 before she'd even finished setting up the counter. She came out from the back, and there he was, standing in the middle of the store, and the way he was standing told her immediately that he already knew. His hat was already in his hands, which he only did when he was uncomfortable. He was looking at a shelf of nails like it contained the answers to questions he hadn't figured out yet. Morning, Lila said. Morning. He looked at her, then back at the nails. Heard some talk yesterday. People talk. Yeah. He set his hat on the shelf next to the nails, which he never did, and crossed his arms. Is it true? Grayson made you an offer? He did. A muscle moved in his jaw. That was fast. He's a man who knows what he wants. Jonah nodded slowly. He picked up a box of nails, looked at the price, put it down. What are you going to do? And this right here, was the moment Lila had been circling her whole adult life. The moment where she could say, I'm still thinking. I haven't decided. What do you think I should do, Jonah? And let the question hang in the air between them like an open door. She almost did it. She could feel the words forming. Instead, she said, I'm still working it out. He can give you a lot, Jonah said. He didn't look at her when he said it. That kind of setup, stable land, good numbers, established crew, that's more than most people get. I know what it is. I just mean, he stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. You deserve stability. You've worked hard enough. Lila felt something tighten in her chest, something that had no clean name. It was gratitude and pain at the same time, the particular ache of being cared for in entirely the wrong direction. That's very thoughtful, she said, and her voice was perfectly level. He finally looked at her. Are you all right? I'm fine, Jonah. He stood there for another moment, like he was waiting for something he didn't know how to ask for. Then he picked up his hat, picked up the nails, and brought them to the counter. She rang him up. He paid exact. He said, "Thank you, Lila," in a voice that was slightly different from his usual voice, slightly lower, like the words had more weight than he'd intended. And then he walked out. She watched the door close behind him. She took the folded paper out of her pocket, unfolded it, and looked at the blank side again for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a single word on that side of the line. She stared at what she'd written. Then she folded the paper again, tucked it in her apron pocket, and went back to work. And went back to work. That afternoon, Walter Grayson came in to buy a few provisions for his ride home. He chose what he needed without asking her help, brought it to the counter, and paid. Then he looked at her. "You've been thinking," he said, "all day. And?" "I have a question," Lila said. "Not about the finances. About something else." "Go ahead." "If I come," she said, "and I find after a year that the arrangement isn't working, that I'm not what you needed, or you're not what I can live with, what happens?" He didn't hesitate. "There's a provision in the contract. Either party can dissolve the arrangement at the 1-year mark with an agreed settlement. You would leave with what you brought and a fair sum for your labor." "You put that in the contract yourself?" "My first wife suggested it, actually, before we married. She said any arrangement that couldn't survive scrutiny wasn't worth making." He paused. "She was right." Lila nodded slowly. "I don't need an answer tonight," Walter said. "Tomorrow morning is soon enough." He picked up his parcel and left. And Lila stood alone in her store, looking at the last pale light coming through the front window, and thought about a woman she'd never met who had asked for an exit clause before saying yes, and what that said about the man she'd asked it of. She thought about that for a long time. The answer came to her at 2 in the morning when she was lying awake in the small room above the store listening to the wind come down off the hills. It wasn't the logical answer. She knew what the logical answer was, i.e., she'd been running the numbers all day and the logical answer was clear and unambiguous and pointed in one direction. But there was a thing she'd written on that paper, on the blank side of the line, and it was still true no matter what the numbers said. She got up and went to her desk and sat in the dark and looked out the window at the street below, empty and quiet. She thought about spending the rest of her years on a prosperous ranch, managing accounts and systems and crew, with a man who respected her capabilities and treated her decently, and would never once make her feel the way she felt when Jonah Pike leaned on her counter and talked about nothing for an hour and a half. She thought about what May had said, about known numbers and unknown ones. She thought about Jonah standing in the store that morning with his hat in his hands and his eyes on a shelf of nails, telling her she deserved stability, saying every right thing except the one that mattered. She picked up the folded paper. She opened it. On the blank side of the line, in her own handwriting, was a single name. She sat with it for a long time. Then she set the paper down and she made her decision. Not the one anyone was expecting, and not the one she herself might have predicted a week ago. She made the decision the way she did everything, quietly, completely, without anyone watching. By the time the sun came up over Dust Creek, Lila Harper knew exactly what she was going to say. To both of them. She was at the counter by 6:30, same as always. That was the thing about Lila Harper that most people in Dust Creek never fully appreciated. The absolute consistency of her. Rain, wind, personal crisis, sleepless nights spent making decisions that would reshape the rest of her life. It didn't matter. The store opened at 7. The counter was ready at 6:30. The accounts were in order. Whatever was happening inside her stayed inside her, because the work didn't pause for feelings, and she had learned that early and learned it well. But her hands weren't steady this morning. She noticed it when she was counting out the float for the cash drawer. Kept losing her place at 7, having to start the stack over. She did it 3 times before she set the coins down and pressed both palms flat on the counter and just breathed for a moment. Walter Grayson wanted her answer by morning. She had an answer. She'd had it since 2 in the morning, sitting at her desk in the dark with a folded piece of paper, and the particular silence of a woman who has finally stopped arguing with herself. The answer was clear. What wasn't clear, what she hadn't fully worked out in the dark hours before dawn, was how to live with everything that came attached to it. The bell above the door rang at 7:04. It was not Walter Grayson. It was May Dunbar, carrying a covered plate and wearing the expression of a woman who had made up her mind to be supportive regardless of what happened, which was the most exhausting kind of supportive there was. "I made biscuits," May said, setting the plate on the counter. "May, don't argue with biscuits, Lila. Nobody wins that fight." She lifted the cloth. They were good biscuits, tall, golden, the kind May only made when she thought a situation called for fortification. "Did you sleep?" "Some." "Did you decide?" Lila looked at her. "Yes." May waited. When nothing else came, she said, "Are you going to tell me?" "Not yet." May pulled her mouth to one side. "That means it's complicated." "Everything's complicated. Some things are more complicated than others." May broke off a corner of biscuit and ate it without apparent self-consciousness. "He's already at the hotel having breakfast, you know, Grayson. I saw him through the window on my way here. Very composed for a man waiting on an answer. He's a composed kind of man." "Is that good or bad?" Lila picked up a biscuit. It was still warm. She ate half of it without answering. May watched her. "What did Jonah say when you told him?" "I didn't tell him anything. He'd already heard. Half the town had already heard before I'd finished the conversation." "What did he say when he heard?" "He said Walter Grayson could give me a lot." Lila set the biscuit down. "He said I deserved stability." May was quiet for a moment. "That's what he said." "That's what he said." Another silence. May refastened the cloth over the plate with the careful movements of a woman choosing her next words. "You know, sometimes people say the thing they think is generous when they're actually just afraid to say the thing they mean." "I know that, May. I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying." Lila picked up the half biscuit again. "I've been knowing what you're saying for about 6 years. May looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite admiration, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. And some things can't wait on somebody else's timeline forever." Lila finished the biscuit, brushed the crumbs off her hands. "I have to open up." May gathered herself, picked up her plate, and headed for the door. At the threshold, she stopped and turned back. "Whatever you decide, it's the right decision, because you made it." "That's a convenient thing to believe." "Maybe, but I believe it anyway." The bell rang, and she was gone. Lila turned the sign on the door to open. The first customer came in 12 minutes later, old Hector Vane, wanting tobacco. And after that, the morning moved the way mornings did, steady and unremarkable, and Lila worked through it with the automatic competence of someone whose hands knew the job well enough to do it, while the rest of her was somewhere else entirely. Walter Grayson came in at 10:15. He didn't come to the counter right away. He came in, closed the door quietly behind him, and stood just inside the entrance for a moment, reading the room the way he seemed to read everything, assessing, cataloging, making sure he understood the terrain before he moved through it. There were 2 other customers in the store. He waited until one of them paid and left. Then he walked up. "Miss Harper." "Mr. Grayson." She folded her hands on the counter. "I have an answer for you." "I thought you might." He set his hat on the counter. Not in front of her, off to the side, which was oddly considerate, the gesture of a man who had been told at some point not to put things between himself and the person he was talking to. "Let me hear it." Lila had thought about how to say this. She'd practiced the words in her head in the small hours, trying to find the arrangement that was honest without being cruel, that was clear without being cold. She'd had a whole careful speech assembled. What came out instead was simpler than that. "I think you're a serious man," she said, "and I think your offer is a serious one, and I don't take it lightly. You came here with respect, and you've treated me with respect, and that matters." He was watching her steadily. "But I can't marry you," she said. "Not because there's something wrong with what you've offered, because there's something I haven't resolved here, and I won't take your offer as a way to stop having to resolve it. That wouldn't be fair to you." Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, not quite disappointment, but the brief recognition of a man recalibrating. He was quiet for a moment. "Is it the cowboy?" he said. Lila blinked. Excuse me? I heard some things around town yesterday. The one who came in here Tuesday and stayed too long. He wasn't unkind when he said it. He just said it. I'm asking because it's a relevant factor. She thought about lying. She thought about the careful non-answer, the polite deflection. Then she thought about what he'd told her about his first wife and the exit clause in the contract and decided he deserved at least the same honesty he'd given her. Something like that, she said. He nodded slowly, picked up his hat, turned it once in his hands the way Jonah did, which struck her as an odd parallel she hadn't expected. Then here's what I'll say, Walter said. I'm disappointed because I think we would have built something solid. But I understand a decision that comes from knowing your own mind. He looked at her. That's a harder thing than most people think. It is. If you ever find yourself wrong about this. He stopped, shook his head slightly. Never mind. That's not a useful thing to say. He settled his hat on. You're a capable woman, Miss Harper. Whoever benefits from that is fortunate. He extended his hand. She shook it. And then Walter Grayson walked out of Harper's Supply and out of Dust Creek, and that was the end of the easiest part of Lila's morning. She didn't go find Jonah. She had decided that much in the dark. Whatever happened, she would not chase a man down the street because she'd turned down another man's proposal. That wasn't who she was. If something was going to change, it was going to change because he made a choice, not because she manufactured a crisis to force his hand. So she went back to her accounts. She finished the reconciliation she hadn't been able to finish the day before. She found the 3 discrepancies. 2 were arithmetic errors on incoming orders. 1 was a credit she'd failed to record. And she corrected them and totaled the column, and the number came out right. There was a particular satisfaction in that, in the small, clean rightness of a balanced ledger. And she let herself feel it for a moment before the afternoon mail came in, and she had to shift her attention to a supply order that was 3 weeks late. By 4 o'clock, she was certain Jonah wasn't going to come in. By 5 o'clock, she was annoyed at herself for checking the door. By 5:30, she had firmly settled into a gray and practical acceptance that she had made her choice, and it was possible, likely, even, that the person she'd made it for would never know she'd made it. That was not his fault. She hadn't told him. You couldn't fault a man for not knowing a thing you'd never said. The bell above the door rang at 5:47. She looked up from the mail order form she was filling out, and there was Jonah, still in his work clothes, hat off before the door was even fully closed, and he looked like a man who had spent the day having an argument with himself and wasn't sure yet who had won. You're closing soon, he said. 15 minutes. I won't take long. He came to the counter but didn't lean on it the way he usually did. Stood in front of it. I heard Grayson left. He did. This morning. Yes. Jonah looked at her. Did you give him an answer? I did. What did you... He stopped, rubbed the side of his jaw. You don't have to tell me that. That's your business. I told him no, Lila said. The stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness. He had a natural quiet to him. She'd always known that. It was one of the things she'd noticed first. But this was a different quality of quiet, the kind that came from the sudden reordering of something inside. Why? He said. And here it was. Here was the moment she had been running through in her head for 2 days, and it turned out there was no good version of it. No arrangement of words that didn't expose the thing she'd spent 6 years keeping carefully out of the light. Because I've spent 6 years waiting for something I want more, she said. And I wasn't willing to walk away from it for a practical arrangement, no matter how reasonable the practical arrangement was. Jonah was very still. I'm not telling you that to put something on you, she said. I'm telling you because you asked, and because I'm tired of not being honest about it. I've been honest about everything in this store for 6 years except that one thing, and I'm done with that particular piece of dishonesty. He put both hands on the counter, flat, like he needed something to hold on to. Lila, you don't have to say anything, she said. I mean that. I'm not telling you so you'll feel obligated. I'm telling you because... She stopped, because the real reason was harder to say than she'd expected, and her voice was doing something unreliable. She steadied it, because I'm 34 years old, and I've been careful my whole life, and being careful hasn't gotten me everything I wanted, and I thought it was time to stop being so careful about this one particular thing. The last customer of the day came in then. A young woman named Clara who needed lamp oil and paid quickly and didn't look at either of them, though she had clearly registered the atmosphere, and she was out the door in under 2 minutes with the instinct of a person who understands when they've walked into the middle of something. When she was gone, the store went quiet again. The last of the afternoon light was coming through the west window, laying a long stripe across the floor between them. Jonah still had both hands on the counter. He was looking at them, not at her. "I heard about the offer yesterday morning," he said, "before I came in. I know. I went home and I told myself—" He stopped, started again. "I told myself you'd be better off, that Grayson could give you things that I don't have. And I believed that. I think I actually believed it." He looked up. "But then I was out in the east pasture this afternoon fixing a section of fence that's been giving me trouble for 3 weeks, and I kept thinking that if you left, I'd come in here and there'd be someone else behind this counter, and I don't—" Something in his face shifted, became less careful. "I don't know how to make that thought sit right." "Jonah, I'm not good at this," he said. "You know that. You've watched me not be good at it for years. I know. I don't have 4,000 acres. I don't have a crew of 18. I've got 40 head on rocky ground and a fence line that apparently takes 3 weeks to fix and a house that needs a new roof before winter. I know what you have, Jonah. I've been doing your accounts." Something in that cracked through whatever was holding him back. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Just barely. Not. "Yeah," he said. "You have." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to settle. I need you to understand that's not what this is." "What is it then?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet she'd learned to read over years of watching him think. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to build something," he said finally, "with me, on what I've got, which isn't much, and what you've got, which is considerably more than you give yourself credit for. I'm asking if that's a thing you'd want." Lila looked at him for a long moment. "I turned down 4,000 acres this morning," she said. "What does that tell you?" He looked at her steadily. "That you're either very confident or very stubborn. Probably some of both." "Yeah." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. "That's what I figured." She came around from behind the counter. Not because she'd planned to, her feet just did it, the way things do when the thinking part of you finally stops arguing with the knowing part. She stopped a couple of feet in front of him. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I keep very precise records, and I have opinions about how things should be organized, and I will absolutely redo your bookkeeping system because whatever you're currently doing is not a bookkeeping system. I know. And I'm going to need you to actually say things. Not just stand in the middle of my store turning your hat in your hands and hoping I'll interpret the silence correctly." "That's fair. I've been interpreting your silences for 6 years and I'm tired." "Lila." He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, just took it the way you'd take something you'd been meaning to pick up for a while and kept leaving on the shelf. His hand was rough and warm, and it fit around hers with the ease of something that had been waiting to happen. "I'm sorry I was slow." She looked at their hands. "You were very slow." "I know." "Unreasonably slow." "I know that too." She looked up at him. "Don't do it again." "I'll do my best." It wasn't a romantic declaration. It wasn't the kind of moment that got described in the kind of stories women were supposed to want. There was no dramatic gesture, no perfectly crafted words, just a man who had taken too long and a woman who had run out of patience for waiting, and both of them standing in a general supply store in the last light of a Wednesday afternoon. It was exactly right. She didn't close the store on time that night. They talked until the light was gone, and she had to light the lamp behind the counter, and even then they kept talking, leaning against opposite sides of the counter with the lamp between them throwing uneven light across the shelves. He told her about the fence line and why it had taken 3 weeks, a water issue she hadn't known about, a section of the creek that had been undercutting the ground, and she told him about the supply order that was 3 weeks late and the argument she was going to have with the regional wholesaler about it. Normal things, practical things, the kind of things that don't sound like the beginning of a life, but are. At some point, May Dunbar walked past the window, looked in, stopped, looked harder, and then walked on with the deliberate casualness of a woman who was going to have a great deal to say tomorrow and was saving it up. Jonah left at 8:30. At the door, he turned back. "Can I come by tomorrow morning?" he said. "You come by every week." "I mean, earlier than usual." She looked at him. "How early?" 7? "The store opens at 7. "I know." A pause. "I could help you open." It was such a small thing, such a quiet, ordinary thing. She had opened that store alone for 6 years. Help you open. She felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't known was braced. 7, she said. "Don't be late." After he left, she locked the door and turned off the lamp and stood in the dark for a moment. The store was quiet around her. The familiar smell of it, dry goods and leather and pine. The creak of the floor she'd walked so many thousands of times. She had turned down security for uncertainty, comfort for something that hadn't yet proven what it was. Every practical instinct she had told her the math was risky. She thought about the folded piece of paper upstairs on her desk, the name she'd written on the blank side. She was not afraid of the math. She blew out the lamp and went upstairs. He was there at 7. Not at 7:01 or 7:03, not at the just past 7 that she had learned to expect from people who said 7, but meant approximately 7. He was there at 7, standing outside the door with his hat in his hand, and when she unlocked and pushed it open, he walked in and said, "What needs doing first?" She put him to work restocking the back shelves, the heavy stuff, the things she usually did herself that took longer than they should. He did it without asking unnecessary questions, which she appreciated. He was efficient, which she hadn't expected, or maybe she had, and just hadn't let herself expect it. At 7:30, Clarence Rutherford came in for his tobacco and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of Jonah Pike behind the shelves. He looked at Jonah. He looked at Lila. He looked back at Jonah. Then he walked to the tobacco shelf with the profound dignity of a man pretending he'd seen nothing interesting. "Morning, Lila," he said. "Morning, Clarence." "Nice day." "It is." He paid for his tobacco. At the door he paused and without turning around said, "Good to see you, Pike." "Clarence," Jonah said, and then he was gone, and Lila kept her face absolutely neutral even though she could feel the smile wanting to happen. By 9 o'clock it was clear that word had made its round. People came in on errands that didn't need doing, the same way they had 2 days ago. Except this time they weren't coming to see a wealthy rancher make a proposal. They were coming to see whether Jonah Pike was actually there, and whether what they'd heard was true. He was there. He helped a woman carry a sack of flour to her wagon without being asked. He answered a question about wire gauge from one of the younger ranch hands without deferring to Lila, which told her he'd been paying attention to more than she'd realized over all those Tuesday visits. Ruth Heller came in at 10, looked at Jonah for a long moment, and then said to Lila in a carrying voice, "Well, I suppose that's decided then." "Good morning, Ruth," Lila said. "Good morning." Ruth picked up a spool of thread. "He'll need to fix that roof before the first snow." "I'm aware," Jonah said from behind the shelves. "I wasn't talking to you," Ruth said pleasantly. She put the thread on the counter. "I was talking to the woman who'll have to live under it." Lila caught the look on Jonah's face when he came around the end of the shelves, somewhere between mortification and reluctant amusement. And she thought, yes. Yes, this is going to be difficult and imperfect and full of small embarrassments and complications and moments where one of them has to make space for the other's irritating habits. And there will be arguments about the bookkeeping and the roof and 50 other things she couldn't predict yet. That was fine. She was good at working through difficult things. She had done it her whole life. The difference was that now she would have someone to work through them with. Ruth paid and left. The morning continued. The store ran the way it always ran, which was to say with Lila managing most of it, and some things going slightly sideways and getting corrected, and then a customer saying something funny, and then a small crisis about a bill of goods that turned out not to be a crisis after a second look. At noon, Jonah brought her a cup of coffee from the back room. She hadn't asked for it. He'd just made it, because he'd noticed she'd been running since 6:30 without stopping. and set it on the counter without a word and went back to what he was doing. She wrapped both hands around the cup. It was the right temperature. It had been made the way she made it, which meant he'd been watching that too. She drank it and looked out the window at the main street of Dust Creek in the bright November noon and thought about the paper upstairs with a name on it. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was arrived. The weeks after Walter Grayson left Dust Creek were not the romantic idyll that Ruth Heller and May Dunbar might have scripted for them. They were something better and considerably more complicated than that. Jonah kept coming in at 7. Not every day. He had a ranch to run, 40 head to feed and water and move, fences that needed constant attention, and the creek issue that had been undermining his east pasture for longer than he'd let on. But 4 mornings out of 7, he was at the door when she unlocked it, and on the other 3 he came in before noon, and somewhere in the second week Lila stopped noting the pattern and simply expected it, which was its own kind of thing. They were careful with each other in the way that people are when something new and not yet named is growing, and they don't want to jar it loose by handling it wrong. There were moments, his hand near hers when he passed something across the counter, a look held a beat too long over the coffee he kept making without being asked, that said everything neither of them had found the exact words for yet. And then someone would come in needing seed or wire or credit, and they'd both step back into the ordinary business of the day. And the moment would pass, and they'd let it. May said it was like watching 2 people try to cross a frozen creek by testing each inch of ice before they put weight on it. Lila told her she was mixing her metaphors, and May said she didn't care. It was still accurate. What complicated things further, what Lila hadn't anticipated, though she probably should have, was the change in how people looked at her, or more precisely, looked at them. Dust Creek was not a large town, and it had limited entertainment, and it had watched Lila Harper run her store alone and manage her own affairs without asking anyone for anything for 6 years. The fact that she had turned down Walter Grayson's offer, and then within 24 hours had Jonah Pike restocking her shelves at 7 in the morning, was the kind of development that a town like Dust Creek could dine out on for months. Some of it was warm-hearted. People who had watched Jonah's Tuesday visits with affectionate exasperation for years felt a certain satisfied vindication. Old Hector Vane clapped Jonah on the shoulder one morning and said, "About time," without any further context, which turned out to be more than enough. Clara from the lamp oil errand left a pie on the counter one afternoon with no explanation attached, which was Dust Creek's way of expressing approval. But some of it was the other kind of attention, the kind that measured and assessed and waited for things to go wrong. Dust Creek had a few people who kept this kind of social ledger, who liked nothing better than watching someone reach for something good and come up short. And those people were watching too. Tom Haskell was one of those people. He ran the feed and grain operation on the north end of town, a larger establishment than Harper's Supply, better capitalized, with a warehouse out back and 2 hired men in the steady, profitable business of serving the bigger ranchers in the valley. He and Lila had always maintained a careful professional civility. They served slightly different customer bases. Their inventories didn't overlap much, and as long as that remained true, there was no particular friction between them. What Tom Haskell did not like, what he had never liked, though he'd been smart enough to keep it private, was the particular respect people in Dust Creek had for Lila Harper. The way ranchers talked about her accounts, the way people said you should check with Lila before you made any decision involving money. The way that Walter Grayson, one of the most powerful men in the valley, had come to Dust Creek specifically for her and nobody else. Tom Haskell had been in Dust Creek for 11 years, and nobody had ridden 2 days to offer him a marriage contract. He started small. A comment here, a question there, nothing you could pin down. He mentioned to a couple of the larger ranch operators that it was interesting, wasn't it, how Lila Harper had turned down a solid business offer from a man with a proven operation. And what did that tell you about her judgment? He said it in the easy tone of a man who was merely thinking aloud, not making any particular point. The kind of thing that settles into people's thinking without them noticing it arrived from somewhere. Lila heard about it third hand, the way you hear about most things in small towns. A comment that had passed through 2 other people before it reached her and picked up inflection along the way. May told her on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week, leaning on the counter with her biscuit plate absent for once, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone delivering news they don't enjoy delivering. "He's not saying anything outright," May said. "You know how he is. It's all interesting, and I wonder, and what do you think that means?" "I know how he is," Lila said. "Are you going to do anything about it?" "What would I do? Go confront the man for having opinions?" She was tallying a column of figures, and she didn't stop. "If I reacted every time Tom Haskell had an opinion, I'd have time for nothing else." Jonah heard it. Lila's pen stopped. "He was at the feed store yesterday for something they don't carry here," May said. "And apparently Tom said something within earshot about whether you were actually competent or whether you'd just been coasting on people's goodwill all these years. Because a genuinely smart businesswoman would have recognized a good offer when it came." What did Jonah do? Nothing, apparently. Just paid for his order and left. May paused. But he didn't look right for the rest of the afternoon, according to Clara, who saw him in the street. Lila set the pen down. She could feel something tightening in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, but contained elements of both. Not at Tom Haskell, particularly. She had always known Tom Haskell was that kind of man, and she had factored it into her understanding of the world and moved on. What tightened in her chest was the specific discomfort of having her private life out in the air where it could be poked at. She had kept herself so carefully private for so long. It was disorienting to be visible. "Jonah should have said something," May said. "Jonah doesn't owe me a scene in the feed store." "I didn't say a scene. I said something." "May." Lila picked up the pen again. "It's fine." "It's not fine. It's just manageable. And those aren't the same thing." Lila looked at her. "I'm just saying there's a difference," May said, and let it go. Booked. Jonah came in that evening at closing time. He'd done that a few times in the past weeks, showed up at 10 to 6 and helped her close up, moving through the store with a quiet usefulness she'd come to rely on faster than she'd expected. He could read whether she wanted to talk or just wanted the company of someone else being productive in the same room, and he mostly got it right. He got it wrong tonight. He was too quiet. The specific quality of quiet that meant he was holding something rather than just being the person he was. She noticed it around the third shelf. He straightened without saying a word. "May told me," Lila said. He turned. "Told you what?" "About what Haskell said at the feed store." Something moved through his expression. The complicated look of a man caught between being glad he doesn't have to explain and being irritated at being discussed. "She shouldn't have. She's my friend. It's her job to tell me things." Lila folded the cloth over the flour barrel. "What are you not saying?" "Nothing." "Jonah." He set down the box of goods he'd been about to move, turned to face her properly. "I don't like that people are talking about you because of me. People were talking about me before you were involved. People talked about me when I ran the store alone and when my father died and when I paid off the debt and when Grayson came to town. People here talk about whatever's in front of them. That's not new. This is different." "How?" "Because I'm part of it now." He said it plainly, without drama, and the plainness of it was what made it land. "And I'm not bringing you trouble. That's not what I want to be." Lila looked at him for a moment. Outside, the last of the evening traffic was passing on the main street, the sound of wagon wheels on packed dirt, someone calling out to someone else. Normal sounds. Ordinary evening. She thought about the folded paper on her desk and the decision she'd made at 2 a.m. and whether she was going to let Tom Haskell's comments become the thing that complicated it. "Jonah," she said, "I turned down a man with 4,000 acres and a 2-day ride to get here because I wasn't willing to build my life around something practical and safe. If I was going to be careful, I would have been careful already." She held his eyes. "Tom Haskell has been in this town 11 years, and he's never once offered to help anyone carry their flour to their wagon. I'm not interested in his opinion of my judgment." Jonah was quiet for a moment, then, "He said you'd been coasting." "I heard." "On goodwill." "I heard that part too." "Do you want me to?" "No," she said firmly. "I do not want you to go do anything about Tom Haskell. The best answer to Tom Haskell is to keep the store running well and the books clean and let that be what it is." She paused. Besides, his accounts don't balance. I've suspected it for 2 years. I don't know who's doing his books, but there are discrepancies in his orders that don't match what I know he's selling. Jonah stared at her. How do you know that? Because people talk to me, Jonah. That's been true my whole life. They tell me things and I listen and I remember. She went back to closing up. I don't plan to do anything with that information unless he pushes me to. But I know it. He stood there for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of something. Then he picked up this box again and moved it where it was supposed to go and said, I'll come by Saturday. I found a piece of equipment that's going to be useful for the East pasture if the hardware on it is what I think it is. I want you to look at the specifications before I decide. Bring them Saturday. 7? 7. And that was that. It was not a grand resolution of anything. The issue with Tom Haskell wasn't resolved. It was simply set aside the way you set aside a problem that requires a longer game than a single evening's conversation. But the thing between them was steadier for it. Something in Jonah's expression had settled, and when he left he paused in the doorway and looked back the same way he always did, and said good night, and she said good night, and it was ordinary and quiet and theirs. Basik. Saturday came with the first real cold of the season, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the quality of the air, a dry, flat stillness that meant the hills had started holding their breath. Jonah brought the equipment specifications as promised, a hand-drawn diagram on folded paper that he spread out on the counter while she looked it over. She asked 3 questions. He answered 2 of them well, and the third one stopped him, and after a moment's thought he said she was right and he'd need to check the manufacturer before he committed. You're not going to just buy it, she said. Not when you find a question I can't answer. He folded the paper up. That's the point of asking you. She handed his paper back. The point of asking me, or the point of being the kind of man who asks? He looked at her, not offended, thinking. Both, he said finally. I guess it's both. That afternoon, while Jonah was out back fixing a hinge on the storeroom door that she had mentioned needing attention twice in the past week, and neither of them had said who was going to fix it, Lila had a customer she hadn't expected. The woman was perhaps 60, compact and weathered in the way of someone who had spent decades outdoors, and she came into the store with the direct movement of a person who knew exactly what she wanted and didn't plan to spend extra time getting it. Lila had never seen her before. She bought salt, a length of rope, and a box of cartridges. A practical list that told her this was a working woman, not a town woman. And when she paid, she said, "You're the one who turned down Walter Grayson." It was said without judgment, just as identification. The way you'd say, "You're the one who has the Palomino." "That's me," Lila said. "I worked for him. 3 years." She tucked her change into her coat. "Good employer, fair wages. Not easy to be around all day, but fair." "I got that impression." "He came back to the valley and told his foreman you'd turned him down because you had unfinished business of your own." The woman looked at her steadily. "Most women in your position would have taken that offer." "I know. I'm not saying you were wrong." She picked up her parcel. "I'm saying it takes something to know what you want and stick to it when something easier is in front of you." She looked toward the back of the store, in the direction from which the occasional sound of Jonah working on the hinge was audible. "Is he worth it?" Lila considered the question. It was the kind of question she'd been asking herself in one form or another for 6 years. "I think we're worth it," she said. "Whether he is specifically, I'm still working that out." The woman nodded once, as if this were the correct answer. "That's the honest thing to say." She headed for the door. "Good store, by the way, clean and well organized. I'll be back when I'm through this way again." "I'll be here," Lila said. After she left, Jonah came back in from the storeroom, wiping his hands on a rag. "Hinge is fixed. You had the wrong size screws in it. That's why it kept slipping." "I know. I ordered the right ones twice, and they kept sending the wrong ones." He looked at the door where the woman had left. "Who was that?" "I don't know her name. She worked for Grayson." Lila went back to her accounts. "She said he told his foreman I turned him down because I had unfinished business." Jonah was quiet for a moment. "He said that?" "Apparently." Another moment. That's a decent thing for a man to say." "It is." She turned a page. "He was a decent man. That was never the issue." I know. He put the rag down. Lila. Hmm. I know I said I'd do my best about not being slow. He was at the counter now. And I've been thinking about what that actually means, what it looks like going forward, not just showing up at 7 and fixing hinges. She looked up from the accounts. I want to be clear, he said, about what I'm asking. I'm not asking you to wait anymore. I'm asking you to start something, and I want to know if that's what you want too, or if I'm still... He stopped. If I'm still behind. The afternoon light was doing its November thing, going gold and flat through the west window. From outside came the sound of horses on the street, a woman calling to her child, a dog barking twice and stopping. The sounds of a small town in the late afternoon, familiar as breathing. You're not behind, Lila said. He nodded, slowly. All right. But Jonah, I need to know you're going to keep talking, not just when something pushes you to, not just when there's a crisis. I spent 6 years reading your silences, and I'm not willing to do that for the rest of my life. I understand. Do you? Because understanding it in theory and actually doing it when it's easier to just be quiet? Lila. He met her eyes. I know the difference. I've had 6 years to watch what the silence cost. He paused. I'm not going to get it right every time. I'll probably get it wrong more than I want to, but I know what I'm trying to do now, and I didn't before, and it's different. It matters. She held his gaze for a moment. The particular quality of this, the imperfect honesty of it, the admission that he would fail, and the declaration that he understood why it mattered, was more convincing than any smooth promise would have been. A man who tells you he'll get it wrong is a man who has actually thought about what getting it wrong looks like. Okay, she said. Okay. Come for supper Sunday, she said. I'll cook. Don't bring anything. He smiled then, the full version, the one she'd seen only a handful of times over 6 years and had been privately cataloging each one. 7 again? Sunday dinner is at noon, Jonah. Right. He picked up his hat. Noon. He came at noon. He was on time. He brought nothing as instructed, and then at the door he pulled a small jar of honey from his coat pocket and said he'd found it at the market, and it seemed wrong to come empty-handed, which made her laugh. A real laugh, the kind that came up unexpectedly. And she took the honey and let him in. She had made a simple meal, nothing trying to impress, nothing complicated. A beef stew with root vegetables that had been on the stove since morning, cornbread, the honey that was now apparently part of the menu. He ate 2 portions without being asked if he wanted more, which she took as the genuine compliment it was, and they talked through the meal the way people do when the talking has gotten easier, not filling silences so much as moving through them, stopping to say something when they had something to say. He told her about the creek problem in more detail than he had before. The water had been undercutting the northeast corner for 2 seasons, longer than he'd let on, and the cost of addressing it properly had scared him off twice. Now it was at the point where it couldn't be deferred anymore. He laid it out plainly, the scope, the cost, the timeline, in the way a man presents a problem to someone he trusts to look at it clearly. She listened. She asked questions. She got up and found a piece of paper and made him draw the approximate layout of the pasture and the creek's path, because she needed to see the shape of something to think about it properly, a habit she'd had since her father taught her to reconcile accounts. You could divert here, she said, putting her finger on the paper. If this section is what I think it is, there's a natural grade that would redirect the flow east. You'd need to dig, but not as far as you probably think. He looked at the paper, then at her. How do you know that? Earl Briggs had the same problem on his south pasture 4 years ago. I helped him work out the cost breakdown and in the process learned more than I needed to about creek drainage. She pushed the paper back toward him. He spent less than he expected because he went at the grade rather than trying to bank against it. Jonah stared at her for a moment. You know about creek drainage. I know about whatever people bring into my store. She started to clear the bowls. You've been coming in for 6 years and you've talked about that east pasture. I've been paying attention. He was quiet for a moment while she moved around the kitchen. Then, I talked about it? Not directly, but you mentioned the fence problems, and the fence problems moved. And the grade of your land I got from the survey documents you had me help you file 2 years ago. She came back to the table. I've been building a picture. I do that with everyone. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the slow, considering look she knew well, and not the rare, full smile. Something else. Something that was taking him a moment to put words to. What? She said. I'm trying to figure out why I waited 6 years, he said, and I can't find a good answer. Because you're cautious, she said, and you'd convinced yourself you didn't have enough, and I never told you that what you had was exactly what I wanted. She sat down across from him. We both waited too long. Let's not make it mean more than it does. It means something. It means we were both afraid. That's human. We're past it now. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same way he'd done it that first evening in the store. Simple, unhurried, like he'd just decided it was time to stop leaving something on the shelf. Yeah, he said, we're past it. Outside, the November afternoon was doing what November afternoons did, going gray and purposeful. There was a smell of weather on the air. Not snow yet, but the thinking about snow, the consultation of clouds and wind that preceded it. The stove was warm. The honey jar sat between them on the table, catching the light. It was not a perfect afternoon. The stew had been slightly oversalted, and she'd noticed it and felt the small frustration of having gotten that wrong on the one Sunday he was here for dinner. The cornbread was fine, but not her best. The drawing of the pasture lay between them, covered in pencil marks and Lila's calculations, thoroughly unromantic, the working papers of two people trying to solve a practical problem. She would not have changed a thing about it. Well, the following Monday, Tom Haskell made the mistake of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. Lila didn't know the details until later. She was in the store all morning, and the incident happened at the post office, which was 3 doors down. But May came in at noon with the specific expression of a woman delivering urgent news she is both distressed by and unable to entirely conceal being interested in. What had happened was this. Tom Haskell had been in the post office at the same time as Jonah, picking up his weekly delivery, and he had made a comment, again in the sideways, plausible deniability manner he preferred, about how it was something to see a man spend his mornings at a woman's store when he had a ranch that clearly needed more attention than it was getting. He'd said it to the postmaster, not to Jonah directly, but the post office was 12 feet wide and there was nobody in it but the 3 of them. Jonah had put down his mail. He had turned around. He had looked at Tom Haskell for a moment with the particular quality of stillness that precedes something, and Tom Haskell had looked back. You have something you want to say to me, Haskell, Jonah said. You can say it to me. I'm just saying what people notice, Tom said. His voice had been careful. He knew, the way people sometimes know, that he'd miscalculated the distance. Nobody asked what you notice. Jonah picked his mail back up. And if you have something to say about Lila Harper, I'd suggest you think carefully about whether it's worth saying. You've been justing for 3 weeks, Jonah said, and I've let it go because it wasn't my place to take issue with a man's opinions. But there's a difference between having an opinion and making it everyone else's business. He looked at him steadily. She runs a better operation than anyone in this town with less starting capital and nobody's help, and she's been doing it for 6 years while you've been counting other people's money. I'd concern myself with your own accounts if I were you. He left. Tom Haskell said nothing further. When May finished telling her this, Lila stood behind the counter for a moment without speaking. He shouldn't have done that, she said. Lila, I don't need someone to defend me, May. I said that. I know you said it. May leaned on the counter. But maybe there's a difference between someone defending you and someone not being willing to stand in a room while a person talks sideways about about someone he cares about. She paused. He didn't fight anyone. He didn't make a scene. He just said a plain, true thing. Lila looked at her. The other thing he said, May added, was about Haskell's accounts. Lila went very still. He told him to concern himself with his own accounts, May said, in front of the postmaster, who talks. Oh, Lila said. Yeah. Lila took a slow breath. Well, May agreed. He shouldn't have done that without telling me. Probably not. I had a strategy. I know you did. It was a good strategy. It was a very good strategy. May tilted her head. But Jonah's version was faster. Lila opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I need to talk to him. He's at the hardware store. He was coming this way after. May pushed off the counter. I'd give it 10 minutes. She gave it 8. Jonah came through the door looking like a man who had done something he didn't fully regret, but was uncertain about the reception. And Lila looked at him from behind the counter with her arms folded, and he stopped and said, May told you. May told me. I know you said you didn't want me to. You said something about his accounts, she said, in front of the postmaster. I did. That wasn't yours to say. He looked at her steadily. I know. I'm sorry. He meant it. She could tell he meant it. There was no defensive edge to the apology. It came out. He was talking about you and it came out. She looked at him for a long moment. The thing was, she wasn't entirely sorry it had. The thing was, there was a part of her that had watched Jonah Pike stand in her store for 6 years and been patient and sensible. And she was not as indifferent to what he'd said in that post office as she was trying to be. But she also wasn't ready to tell him that, because there was a principle involved, and she meant it. Next time, she said, you tell me first. We decide together. Next time, he said, together. She nodded once, unfolded her arms. There's leftover cornbread in the back if you haven't eaten. He exhaled. I haven't. There's honey too, she said, and went back to her accounts. The cornbread was gone by the time Jonah finished it, and then he stayed another hour helping her with the afternoon inventory, not because she'd asked, and not because he was avoiding going back to the ranch, but because they had arrived at the kind of arrangement where staying was simply what happened when neither of them had a pressing reason to be elsewhere. It was quiet and productive, and Lila noticed that she no longer tracked his presence in the store the way she once had, with that low-level awareness of every movement, every glance. He was just there. That was its own kind of shift, the way something you'd wanted for years could settle into ordinary once you finally had it, not diminishing but deepening, becoming part of the texture of the day. He left at 4. She closed at 6. In between, she thought about Tom Haskell's accounts. She had not been exaggerating when she'd told Jonah she suspected discrepancies. It wasn't a vague intuition. She had specifics, accumulated quietly over 2 years from the kind of information that passed through a supply station without people realizing they were leaving it behind. Ranchers mentioned what they'd paid for feed. Farmhands talked about what supplies had come in and what hadn't. 3 separate customers had mentioned, at separate times and without knowing the others had said it, that Haskell had charged them for goods that arrived short or didn't arrive at all. And when they'd raised it, he'd found ways to make the accounting too complicated to follow. That was not sloppiness. Sloppiness looked different. Sloppiness was random, inconsistent. What she'd been assembling in the back of her mind for 2 years was a pattern, and patterns were what she was good at. The question had always been what to do with it. Confronting Haskell directly was pointless. A man who ran a scheme like that had his books arranged to survive surface scrutiny, and he would deny it with the confident ease of someone who had prepared the denial in advance. Telling the sheriff was possible, but she had nothing the sheriff could act on. Suspicion and second-hand accounts were not evidence. The circuit judge who passed through every November was a better option, but November was weeks away, and the judge was another person to whom she'd need to present something concrete. Jonah's comment in the post office had changed the timing, not because it had forced her hand exactly, but because it had put Haskell on notice that people were paying attention, and a man who knows he's being watched does one of 2 things. He gets more careful, or he gets more aggressive. Lila had been watching Tom Haskell for 2 years, and her assessment of him was that he was not the kind of man who got more careful under pressure. He was the kind who pushed back. She was going to need to be ready for that. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and started writing down everything she knew, with dates and names attached where she had them. It was slow work. She had to be precise, had to distinguish between what she actually knew and what she'd inferred. But by the time she went upstairs, she had 3 pages in a hand so small and neat it had once made a banker laugh, and then go quiet when he understood she'd done it to fit more on the page. She put the pages in the back of the accounts ledger. Then she went to bed and slept better than she had in weeks. November arrived with a cold that had opinions about it. The hills around Dust Creek went gray-brown, the kind of color that meant the last of the grass was gone, and the light changed to the flat particular winter light that made everything look slightly more serious than it was. The store got busier as people stocked up. This was always the way in late fall, the last run of purchasing before weather made travel unpredictable. And Lila worked longer hours and kept more detailed records of what was moving and what wasn't, and adjusted her orders accordingly. Jonah fixed the roof. He didn't announce he was going to do it. He showed up one Saturday morning with materials and a man named Del Ferris from his crew, a quiet person of indeterminate age who nodded at Lila when introduced and then climbed up to the roof with the focused patience of someone who had fixed many roofs and found them all equally straightforward, and by the end of the afternoon the section above the storeroom that had been leaking since September was addressed. Not perfectly. Del Ferris pointed out that the original construction had a flaw in the pitch that would need more substantial work in the spring, but sound enough for the winter. Jonah came down off the roof dirty and considerably colder than he'd gone up. Lila handed him coffee without being asked to and said, "You didn't tell me you were doing this today. I knew if I told you, you'd say not to bother until spring. I would have. And you would have been wrong. That section wouldn't have made it to spring." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "Del says the pitch needs work when the ground softens." "I know about the pitch. I've known about it since the second winter." She leaned against the counter. "I appreciate this." "I want you to know that." "I know you do. I also want you to know that I intend to pay for the materials." "Lila, we're not married," she said plainly. "And even if we were, I would pay for my own roof materials. Don't argue with me about money." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to understand meant he was picking his battles. "Fine," he said. "Good." She pushed off the counter. "Del is staying for supper. I have enough." "I didn't say he was—" "He fixed my roof in November. He's staying for supper." She was already heading to the back. "Tell him to come down when he's put the tools away." She heard Jonah behind her, not saying anything, and then a sound that might have been a quiet laugh. She kept walking. Del Ferris turned out to be a man of very few words, but genuine appreciation for a good stew, which was the second batch she'd made in 2 weeks and considerably better seasoned than the first. He ate with concentration and efficiency and said, "Thank you, ma'am," when he was done with a sincerity that made Lila think he didn't get thanked for much, which told her something about the life of a ranch hand in late November. After Del left, Jonah helped her clear the table. He'd started doing this without being asked, and she'd stopped saying anything about it because she'd concluded he was going to do it regardless. And they stood at either side of the small table with the lamp between them, and she said, "How is the east pasture?" "Better than it was. Still not good." He sat down. "I'm going to need a decision on the creek work before the ground freezes. Once it freezes, it'll have to wait until April, and by April, the damage will be worse." I looked at Earl Briggs's cost figures from 4 years ago. Adjusted for what's changed since, you're looking at roughly twice what he spent, because your diversion would be longer. But if you don't do it, you're losing grazing land every season, which costs more over time than the fix. "I know that. So do it." "It's not simple money, Lila. I'd need to take on debt. Structured debt on infrastructure," she said. "That's what Grayson called his, and his books were solid." She met his eyes. "I can look at what you have and tell you what terms make sense before you go to the bank. Don't go to the bank without knowing what terms make sense." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd do that?" "Of course I would." "I mean—" He stopped, tried again. "You'd spend your time going through my books." "Jonah, your books are 4 pages and a prayer. It won't take long." She said it dry, without cruelty, and he laughed. The real one. The one she'd been privately counting since she'd known him, and she was now up to 11. 4 pages and a prayer, he repeated. "Bring them Thursday." He brought them Thursday. She was right that they didn't take long, as they were not complex, just incomplete, the record-keeping of a man who knew his operation intuitively and had never fully translated that knowledge onto paper. She spent 2 hours filling in the gaps, asking him questions, writing down what he told her, cross-referencing what she knew from his supply purchases over the years. When she was done, she had a complete picture, And the picture was not as dire as he had privately feared and not as comfortable as she might have hoped, but it was workable. "You can carry the creek work," she said, "if you're conservative on everything else through winter and spring. No big purchases, no deferrable repairs deferred because deferring creates costs." She turned the ledger toward him. "Here's what the debt would look like at the bank's standard terms. Here's what I'd propose you counter with. And here's what's non-negotiable." He looked at the numbers. He was quiet for a long time. "You did this in 2 hours," he said. "I've been watching your numbers for 6 years. Most of the work was already done in my head." He looked up at her. Something in his expression was harder to read than usual. Not unhappiness, and not just the slow contemplation she knew well. Something more complicated than that. She waited. "I keep thinking," he said slowly, "about how different the last 6 years would have been." She knew what he meant. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "We're here now." "I know." He looked back at the ledger. "I know." The circuit judge arrived the second week of November, same as always. His name was Augustus Farr. Late 60s, deliberate in everything he did, the kind of man whose silences had the weight of precedent behind them. He stayed 3 days, hearing whatever cases had accumulated since his last visit, and he took his meals at the hotel and his evenings on the hotel porch if the weather permitted, which in November it mostly didn't. Lila had known Judge Farr for 4 years, since the time she'd helped a widow named Edna Caswell navigate a property dispute that nobody else in Dust Creek had been willing to untangle. She had walked Edna through the documentation, organized the evidence, prepared the argument so clearly that when Edna presented it, the judge had looked up halfway through and said, "Who helped you prepare this?" He'd asked Lila the same question when he stopped by the store the following day, and she'd told him she'd helped, and he'd nodded in the manner of a man filing something away for future reference. She went to see him on his second evening. She brought the 3 pages from the back of her ledger and 2 additional pages she'd added since, and she sat down across from him in the small parlor the hotel made available for his use and laid everything out. He read it without speaking. He asked 2 questions. She answered them. Then he set the pages on the table between them and looked at her. "This is organized," he said. "I know how to keep accounts. I mean the case. The documentation of what's missing and what the pattern indicates." He tapped the top page. "You've done the analytical work. What you don't have is the testimony of the people who told you these things." "I know. They're not going to come forward voluntarily. Most of them don't realize they've been shorted. They just know something felt wrong and they couldn't follow the arithmetic. That's the problem." He leaned back. "I can note this. I can keep an eye on it. But without someone willing to make a formal complaint, my hands are tied until he makes a larger mistake." "I think he's going to make a larger mistake soon," Lila said. "He's been more aggressive since some pressure was applied recently." She didn't explain the post office incident. She didn't need to. The judge had been in Dust Creek long enough to understand how things moved in a small town. A man who gets rattled tends to either go quiet or go bigger. "I don't think Tom Haskell goes quiet." The judge studied her for a moment. "What do you want from me, Miss Harper?" "I want you to know it exists," she said, "so that when he does make the mistake, there's already a record. And I want to know what a formal complaint needs to look like so that when someone is ready to make one, they can do it correctly." He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up one of the pages and read a section again. "There's a rancher named Fowler," he said, "south edge of the valley. He mentioned something to me last spring. I didn't have enough context at the time to know what to make of it. I know Fowler. He's bought from me. You might want to talk to him." He set the page down. "Not to pressure him, just to let him know what you've put together. Sometimes people don't realize their piece fits into something larger until someone shows them the picture." "That's useful," Lila said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." He stacked her pages neatly and handed them back. "Keep building it. What you have is a beginning, not a case." She took the pages. "I know the difference." He almost smiled. "Yes," he said. "I believe you do." She went to see Frank Fowler on a Thursday, with Jonah driving because Fowler's place was 8 miles out, and the road was the kind of road that required concentration she didn't want to spend on steering. Jonah knew this without being told, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He understood when being useful meant being in the background. He waited with the wagon while she went in. Fowler was a big man, mid-50s, with the cautious manner of someone who had been burned before and learned to be careful about who he talked to. He made her coffee she didn't particularly want, and she drank it anyway because refusing it would have been a wrong note, and she told him plainly what she had put together and what the judge had said about needing people willing to formalize their experience. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he looked at his coffee cup. "How do I know you're not looking to use this for your own advantage?" he said. "Against Haskell, for your own business." "You don't," she said, "except that I've had Haskell's business pattern in my possession for 2 years and I haven't used it yet, and I didn't come to you until the judge suggested it." She paused. "What I know about you, Mr. Fowler, is that you've bought from me 3 times because your regular supplier's orders kept coming up short. You didn't tell me why at the time. I didn't ask, but I noted it." He looked at her steadily. "You noted it." "I note everything. That's what I do." She set down the coffee cup. "The question isn't whether I'm using this. Of course I am. I'm using it to stop a man who's been stealing from people in this valley for years. What I'm asking is whether you want to be part of stopping it or whether you'd rather wait and see if he stops on his own." A long silence. Outside, the wind was doing something persistent against the side of the house. "What would it involve?" Fowler said. "Writing down what happened, dates, amounts, what was ordered, and what arrived. The judge would look at it." She paused. "You wouldn't be alone in it. When I have enough people, I'll present the whole picture at once. You'll be one name among several." Another silence. "How many others?" "I'm talking to 3 others after you." She had spent the previous evening going through her notes again and identifying the strongest candidates. "If even 2 of you formalize it, the pattern becomes visible in a way it isn't when it's just individual complaints." Fowler picked up his coffee. Set it down. Picked it up again. "Let me think on it." "That's all I'm asking." She stood, and he stood, and at the door he said, "Haskell's not going to like this when it comes out." "I know." "He'll know where it started." "He already suspects. That's not a reason to stop." She pulled on her coat. "A man who does what he does relies on people deciding it's not worth the trouble to stop him. The thing that makes it worth the trouble is that enough people are willing to say so at the same time." Fowler held the door. His expression was difficult to read, the internal arithmetic of a cautious man working out risk and principle. "I'll think on it," he said again. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. Jonah didn't ask how it went until they were a mile down the road. That was right. She'd needed the mile to settle her own thoughts. "He's considering it," she said. "He's cautious. He needs to feel like he's not alone. Are the others more likely?" "One of them is. The other 2 I'm less certain about." She looked at the road ahead. "It may take longer than I want." "How long?" "Through winter, maybe. Into spring." She adjusted the blanket across her knees against the cold. Justice in a small town moves at the speed of courage, and courage takes time to build. Jonah drove for a moment. "What do you do in the meantime?" "Keep the record. Keep building the case. Keep being a person people trust." She glanced at him. "And keep my store running well, since apparently that's the controversial part." "Not controversial anymore," he said. "No?" Tom Haskell went very quiet after the post office. He kept his eyes on the road. "Clarence Rutherford told me he hasn't heard Haskell say anything about you in 3 weeks." "Good." She settled back. Quiet men are easier to build a case against than loud ones. They rode the rest of the way back in the comfortable silence she had once spent years misreading. She no longer misread it. She knew now what it meant when he was simply content, versus when he was chewing on something, versus when he was giving her space to chew on something of her own. 6 years of watching a person wasn't wasted time. It was a different kind of investment. The thing she hadn't anticipated, the thing that came at her sideways in the 3rd week of November and knocked her off balance more than Tom Haskell or circuit judges or anything else had managed, was the letter. It came in the regular post, tucked between a supply catalog and a bill of lading, addressed in a hand she recognized immediately because she had seen it on a contract laid on her counter 6 weeks earlier. The return address was Harlow Valley. She opened it in the back room after the morning rush with the door closed. It was short, 2 paragraphs. Walter Grayson wrote that he hoped she was well. He wrote that the ranch was doing fine and the fall roundup had gone better than expected. And then he wrote that he had been thinking about their conversation and that he wanted to say one thing he hadn't said at the time, that he had been wrong to come at her the way he had, document first, ceremony absent, and that whatever she decided in her life, she deserved better than a man treating her like a line item in a transaction. He said he'd been told that more than once before and kept failing to learn it, and he reckoned it was a thing he owed more people apologies for than her specifically, but she was the most recent, and so she was who he was writing to. He did not ask anything of her. He did not suggest she reconsider. He signed it W. Grayson, and that was all. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her apron, the same pocket where she'd carried the folded piece of paper with Jonah's name on it. That evening, she showed it to Jonah. She hadn't decided whether she was going to. It felt private in a way she was still sorting out, but she found herself handing it to him across the table at supper, and he read it and handed it back without her having to explain why she'd given it to him. "He's an honest man," Jonah said. "He is." Wasn't easy to write that. "No." A pause. "Are you going to write back?" She thought about it. "Yes," she said. "I'll thank him for it. It was a decent thing to do." "Okay. Are you all right with that?" He looked at her. "Lila, he wrote you a respectful letter and apologized for treating you without enough consideration. If I'm not all right with you acknowledging that, then I'm not the kind of man I'm trying to be." He picked up his fork. "Write him back." She watched him for a moment. This right here, the quiet, deliberate reasonableness of it, was what she had been waiting for without knowing exactly what shape it would take. Not grand gestures, not the absence of insecurity, because there was a shadow of it in his face and she could see it, and she appreciated that he didn't pretend otherwise. Just the choice, made plainly, to be the person he wanted to be, even when it cost something. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Just don't make a habit of corresponding with men who propose to you." He was the only one. "Let's keep it that way." She almost laughed. Not quite, but close. "I'll do my best." She wrote the letter the next morning before opening the store. It was brief. She thanked him. She said she thought his late wife had been right to ask for the clause in the contract, and she wished him well with the fall roundup and the operation generally. She did not mention Jonah. It wasn't his business, and it didn't need to be said. She sealed the envelope and put it with the outgoing mail and went to open the store. Jonah was at the door at 7. He had a question about the bank. He'd been to see them about the creek work, and they'd given him terms she needed to look at. And she let him in, and they stood at the counter with his papers spread between them, and she went through the bank's numbers with a pencil, marking the places where the terms were negotiable, and told him exactly what to go back and say. "They'll try to hold the rate," she said. "But the term length is the real issue. Push on the term. And if they won't move, then we look at the Harlow Valley Agricultural Loan Office. They're slower, but their terms are better for land improvement specifically." She handed the papers back. "Go back to the bank first. They know you, and that matters. But don't take what they first offered." He folded the papers. "You're coming with me." She blinked. "What?" "To the bank, when I go back." He held her gaze steadily. "Not to negotiate for me. Just, you understand what I'm saying to them better than I do, and if they say something I'm not getting, I want you there." "Jonah, that's—" She stopped. "People will talk about that. People have been talking about us for 6 weeks. His voice was even. "I'm not making my financial decisions based on what Clarence Rutherford has to say about them." She looked at him for a moment, then, "Fine, but I'm not speaking unless you need me to." "That's all I'm asking." "When?" "Friday. They said Friday morning." "I'll have May watch the store." He nodded, picked up his hat. 7 tomorrow?" 7. He was gone, and she was alone in the store with the morning coming through the window, and the accounts waiting, and the letter to Walter Grayson already in the outgoing mail, and 3 pages of notes about Tom Haskell in the back of her ledger, and a bank appointment on Friday. Her life had not become simpler. She found, to her mild surprise, that she did not want it to be simpler. Simple was what she'd had before, and simple had its virtues, but it also had its particular loneliness, the specific ache of a woman who kept everything running and belonged to nothing that was fully hers. What she had now was more tangled, more contingent, more demanding in ways she was still learning to navigate. She picked up her pen and opened the accounts ledger. Outside, Dust Creek was going about its morning. The light was doing its flat November thing across the street, and she could hear the sound of a wagon coming up from the south end. And somewhere down the block, someone was having a conversation that drifted through the window glass without resolving into words. She started with the column she'd left unfinished the night before, found her place, and began to add. The bank appointment on Friday went the way Lila had predicted it would, which was to say it started badly and ended better than the bank had planned. The loan officer was a man named Gerald Pruitt, 40-something, with the careful manner of someone who spent his professional life deciding how much to trust people and had developed a mild skepticism toward everyone as a result. He knew Jonah by name and knew his operation by reputation. Small, consistent, never defaulted on anything, but also never grown much. And he had laid out the terms with the quiet confidence of a man who expected them to be accepted without substantial negotiation. Lila sat in the chair beside Jonah's and said nothing through the first 10 minutes. She had promised she would stay quiet unless needed, and she kept that promise. And she watched Gerald Pruitt's face while he talked and read what was there without difficulty. He was not a dishonest man. He was a man doing his job, which was to lend money at terms favorable to the bank, and he was good at it. When Pruitt finished laying out the terms, Jonah said, "The rate is what I expected. The term length isn't." Pruitt's expression shifted by a fraction. "Standard term for this category of loan is 5 years, Jonah said. "I know. I'd need 7. "That's not our standard. The work I'm financing improves the land value," Jonah said. "It's not a consumable purchase. In 7 years, the northeast pasture will be worth more than it is now, which makes your security position better, not worse." Pruitt looked at him, then briefly, at Lila. She kept her face neutral. "Where did you get that framing?" Pruitt said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I thought about it," Jonah said, which was technically true. He had thought about it after Lila had explained it to him on Thursday evening in terms he could take into a bank and use as his own, because they were his own. The logic was sound, the situation was his, she had just organized the argument. Pruitt leaned back slightly. He looked at the papers in front of him. He made a notation in the margin that Lila couldn't read from where she was sitting, and then he said, 6 years, and I'd want a payment structure that front-loads the first 2. "That works," Jonah said, before Lila could do anything. She wouldn't have done anything. 6 years with front-loaded payments was within the range she'd told him to accept, and he knew it. When they came out onto the street, the cold hit them, and Jonah exhaled a long breath that was almost a laugh. 6 years, he said. "I told you they'd move on the term. You said push for 7. "I said push for 7 because you were going to get 6. If you'd asked for 6, they'd have held at 5. She turned up her collar. "That's how negotiation works." He looked at her with the expression she was learning to recognize as the one that meant he was simultaneously amused and unsettled by how her mind worked. "You knew what they'd offer before we went in. I knew the range. I didn't know Pruitt specifically, but I knew the type." She started walking toward where they'd left the wagon. "He's fair. He just needed to feel like both sides worked for something." And both sides did. "Yes." She glanced at him. "Are you all right with 6 years?" "I'm better than all right." He caught up to her. "I'm going to get the creek work done before the ground freezes. Dell thinks we can start Monday if the weather holds." "It'll hold through Wednesday. After that, I'm not certain." "How do you know that?" "Earl Briggs's son was in yesterday. He's been watching the cloud pattern from his place on the ridge, and he said Wednesday." She reached the wagon. "Earl's son is rarely wrong about weather." Jonah handed her up. "Is there anything that happens in this valley that you don't have information about?" She considered it. "Not much," she said honestly. "People tell me things. And you remember all of it." "All of it." He climbed up beside her and took the reins. For a moment he just sat there, not moving, looking at the street in front of them. Then he said, "Lila, I need to ask you something." Something in his voice had changed register, lower, more deliberate, the way it got when he was building toward something he'd been thinking about for a while. She turned to look at him. "I've been trying to figure out the right time for this," he said. "And I've concluded there isn't a right time, so I'm going to do it now, in a bank parking lot in November, which is not how I would have planned it. Jonah, I know we're still figuring things out. I know I was slow, and I know I've got a ranch with a creek problem and a roof that needs proper work in spring and 4 pages of accounts." He kept his eyes forward. "But I also know that the last 6 weeks have been different from any 6 weeks of my life before them, and I know what that means, and I don't want to spend more time being slow about things that matter." He finally looked at her. "I'm asking if you'll marry me. Not because it makes practical sense, though it does make practical sense, and not because it's the next logical step, though it probably is. Because I want to. Because I want you there and I want to be there, and I don't want to keep running separate accounts on a life that's already mostly shared." The street was quiet around them. A wagon passed going the other direction, the driver not looking at them. Somewhere down the block, a door opened and closed. Lila looked at Jonah Pike, at the way he was holding the reins he wasn't using, at the set of his jaw, at the particular quality of stillness he had right now that was different from his usual stillness because it was not comfortable but chosen, a man standing on open ground because he'd decided to stand there. "You're not slow," she said. "I've been historically very slow." "You're not slow right now." He held her gaze. "No, I'm not." She had thought, in the abstract, about what this moment would feel like. She had imagined it on a handful of sleepless nights over the years when she'd let herself imagine it, and in those imaginations it had been warmer, quieter, less cold in public. She had not imagined a bank parking lot in November with her breath making small clouds in the air. It was better this way. The real thing was always more ungainly than the imagined version, and she had come to trust ungainly things more than smooth ones. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. Just one, controlled, but she caught the relief in it. The release of something he'd been holding. "Okay," he said. "Okay." She looked at the street ahead. "Now, can we go? It's cold." He laughed. The real one, the full one, 12 now, and she felt it settle in her chest like something warm. He took up the reins and they drove back through Dust Creek in the cold November morning, not touching, not making a display, just side by side on the wagon seat the way they'd been 100 times before, except that now there was a yes between them that hadn't existed an hour ago, and Lila Harper carried it quietly the way she carried most things that mattered to her, without announcing it, without ceremony, keeping it close until she knew what shape it was. She told May that afternoon. May sat down on the stool behind the counter that customers weren't supposed to use and put both hands over her mouth and said nothing for 5 full seconds, which was the longest Lila had ever seen May go without speaking. Then she said, "In the bank parking lot. On the wagon. In front of the bank." "Lila." It was direct and sincere and he meant it. That's what matters. May lowered her hands. Her eyes were bright in a way she was not successfully concealing. "You said yes." "Obviously." "You said obviously." May stood up. 6 years of obviously, and I nearly went out of my mind waiting. You went out of your mind. Imagine how I felt. May laughed. The real one, unguarded. And then she came around the counter and hugged Lila, which was not something they did often. And Lila let it happen and even returned it, which was perhaps more of a concession than she usually made. "Don't cry," Lila said. "I'm not crying." "You're about to." "I'm absolutely not." May stepped back and pressed her fingers under both eyes. "I'm very happy for you. That's different from crying. It's the same physical process." "It is not. Lila Harper, let me have this moment." Lila let her have the moment. Quote, she told Jonah she wanted a simple wedding, not because she was indifferent to the occasion, but because she was indifferent to performance, and most weddings she'd attended had been more about the performance than the thing underneath it. She wanted the thing underneath it, without the fuss. They married in December on a clear, cold Saturday when the light came off the hills in long, bright angles and made everything look sharper than it was. The ceremony was held in the town hall because it was too cold for outside, and neither of them wanted a church. Judge Farr, who was passing back through on circuit, agreed to officiate with the good humor of a man who found it fitting that the woman who'd brought him her careful case notes in November was now getting married in front of him in December. May was there. Del Ferris was there, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt and the same focused patience he brought to roof repairs. Clarence Rutherford was there, and Ruth Heller, and Earl Briggs's son whose name was Thomas and who had been right about the weather. Frank Fowler came, which surprised Lila. They had spoken twice since her visit to his ranch, and she hadn't expected him to make the trip. And he shook Jonah's hand and nodded at Lila with the grave approval of a man who had made a decision about someone's character and was confirming it. About 30 people in all. Lila had made a list and kept it to people who had been genuine rather than people who would feel left out. It was a narrow distinction in a small town, but she knew the difference. Jonah wore his best clothes, which were not very fancy but were clean and well-fitted, and he had his hair cut the day before, which she noticed and said nothing about. He stood very still through the ceremony, the way he stood very still through everything that mattered to him. And when Judge Farr asked if he would marry her, he said yes with the same plain directness he'd used in the bank parking lot, no flourish, no performance, just the word and the weight behind it. She said yes the same way. Afterward, there was food that May had organized without being asked, which was May's particular genius, and people ate and talked, and Clarence Rutherford made a toast that went on slightly too long, and Ruth Heller cried openly and without apology, which was Ruth's particular genius. And at some point in the evening, Lila found herself standing near the window with a plate she'd mostly eaten and looking out at Dust Creek in the dark and thinking about a piece of folded paper with a name on it. She had carried that paper for 6 years in different pockets. She had finally thrown it away the week before the wedding. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just unfolded it one evening, looked at the name and put it in the stove because she didn't need it anymore. The thing it had represented had stopped being a hope and become a fact, and facts didn't need to be written down and kept close to remember. Jonah appeared beside her. He had a cup of coffee. She hadn't seen him get it, and he stood next to her and looked out the window at the same view. "All right?" he said. "Very all right." She leaned into his shoulder slightly. "Ruth is crying. I saw. Clarence's toast was too long." "I know. Del looks like he wants to leave. He'll stay another 20 minutes out of obligation, and then he'll go." He paused. "I know my crew." She did lean against him then, properly, and he shifted to accommodate it without making anything of it. Outside, Dust Creek was quiet and dark and cold, and inside there were 30 people eating May's food and filling the town hall with noise and warmth. And somewhere beyond the dark hills 3 miles out, there was a ranch with a creek drainage project half finished, and a roof that needed work in spring, and 40 head of cattle that didn't care what day it was. It was not the life she had imagined at 20 or 25 or 30. It was better and harder and more real. And she had built it herself from the things she'd actually had rather than from the things she'd wished for. And that distinction mattered to her more than she had words for. Tom Haskell's undoing came in January, which was later than Lila had hoped and faster than she'd feared. It was Frank Fowler who finally formalized his complaint, and he brought with him a rancher named Clay Sutter, whom Lila hadn't spoken to, but who had apparently heard from Fowler and decided on his own to put his experience down in writing. 2 complaints with documentation presented to Judge Farr by mail during his time in the county seat were enough to open a formal inquiry. The judge wrote to Lila in February. She was Lila Pike now on paper, though she kept Harper's Supply under the name Harper because that was what it was and what people knew it as, to tell her that the inquiry was proceeding and that her notes had been formally entered into the record as supporting context. Haskell didn't lose everything immediately. That was not how these things worked, and Lila had never expected it to. What happened was slower and more thorough. An audit, conducted by a man from the county assessor's office over 3 weeks in late winter, that produced a finding of systematic short billing and fraudulent inventory reporting going back at least 4 years. Haskell hired a lawyer. The lawyer was competent, but the records were clear because Lila's notes were clear and Fowler's documentation was detailed, and Clay Sutter turned out to have kept his own receipts in a box under his workbench for 3 years without knowing exactly why he'd been keeping them, only that something had felt wrong and he hadn't wanted to lose the evidence. By April, the feed and grain operation on the north end of town was under a court-ordered review. By May, Haskell had reached a settlement that cost him a significant portion of what he'd built and most of his reputation in the valley. He sold the operation in June to a man from out of the county who had no history in Dust Creek and no existing relationships, and who ran the place quietly and without incident, and who bought his personal supplies from Harper's Supply because it was closer than the alternative. Lila registered none of this with visible satisfaction, which was not because she didn't feel any, but because she had learned early that satisfaction was a private thing and displaying it was usually a way of making yourself smaller than the outcome. What she felt privately was the particular settling sensation of a pattern she had been watching for 2 years reaching its conclusion. The arithmetic had always been there. She had just waited for enough people to read it. The real thing she felt, the thing that was harder to name, was about the people who'd come forward. Fowler, who had been cautious and careful, and ultimately decided that being the kind of man who said nothing was not the kind of man he wanted to be. Sutter, who had kept his receipts in a box for 3 years on instinct alone. The 2 others who had added their names quietly in the final weeks, once it was clear the inquiry was real and would proceed. None of them had been brave in the dramatic sense. They had just been willing, at the moment it counted, to say what they knew. That was, in Lila's experience, what most justice actually looked like. Not one person blowing everything open in a single decisive moment. Enough people willing to say a plain true thing at the right time, in writing, with their names attached. The creek work finished in late March, when the ground was soft enough to work again after the hard freeze. Del Ferris came back with 2 additional men from the next ranch over whom Jonah had hired for the project, and they spent 10 days digging and redirecting and laying stone, and Lila made coffee every morning and brought it out, and was told by Del on the 3rd day that she didn't have to do that, and told by Jonah on the 4th day that she could do whatever she wanted. It was her place, which was the right answer. She had moved to the ranch in January, after the wedding, closing the room above the store and taking what she needed and leaving what didn't matter. She kept the store running. That was never in question. Harper's Supply was hers, and it continued to be hers. But the place she came home to was 3 miles out, a house that needed work in at least 6 places she'd cataloged on her first walkthrough, on 40 acres that were now going to be 40 productive acres once the creek situation was resolved. She had a system for the house the way she had a system for everything. She made lists. She prioritized. She did not try to fix everything at once, which was the mistake impatient people made, and she was not impatient with practical things. The roof came first because it was structural. The kitchen layout came next because she spent more time in it than anywhere else, and the previous arrangement was built for someone shorter and had bothered her every morning for 2 months. The rest she worked through in order of necessity, not preference, which was not always comfortable but was always right. Jonah watched her reorganize his kitchen with the expression of a man who had opinions and was choosing not to express them. She appreciated this. She told him if he had objections she wanted to know, because it was his kitchen too, and she wasn't trying to erase it. "I don't have objections," he said. "I have observations." "What observations?" "The hooks are too high for you." She looked at the hooks in question. They were, in fact, slightly too high. "I'll adjust them." "I can adjust them." "I know you can. I said I'll do it." He looked at her. "You know I can do things too." "I know. I also know how I want them placed specifically." She turned back to what she was doing. "You can pick the next thing to fix. The fence on the south side. That's outside, not inside." "You said I could pick the next thing." She stopped, looked at him. He had the barely there version of the smile, the one that was most of the way gone by the time she caught it. "Fine," she said. "The south fence." They had arguments that winter, real ones, not performances. The specific friction of 2 people who had lived alone for years and developed firm habits and now had to accommodate another person's firm habits in a shared space. She was precise about money in ways that made him feel scrutinized. He was imprecise about time in ways that made her feel disrespected, even when she knew that wasn't the intent. She said things sometimes that were accurate and true, and also harder than necessary. He went silent in moments when speaking would have been better. They worked through all of it, not smoothly. Nothing about either of them was smooth, but consistently, with the willingness to come back to a thing after they'd both had time to be less irritated about it and say what actually needed saying. That, she had come to believe, was the thing, not the absence of friction, the willingness to come back. On an evening in April, when the light was doing the particular thing it did in spring, longer and warmer than winter but not yet summer, a light that still had some surprise in it, Jonah found her at the table with her ledger. This was not unusual. She did the books for both operations now, the store and the ranch, in the same ledger with different color ink, because keeping them separate in her mind was easier when they were separate on the page. He put a cup of tea beside her without being asked. He'd started doing this without being asked, this winter, noticing when she needed something and providing it without making it a thing. She had not told him how much this meant to her. She probably should, at some point. She was still working on saying the things that were hard to say, the soft ones as much as the difficult ones. He sat down across from her and didn't say anything. He had papers of his own, Dell's notes on the creek work, a final accounting of what the project had actually cost versus what they'd projected. And he spread them out and looked at them with the slow concentration he brought to numbers, which was different from how he concentrated on physical things, but no less complete. The house was quiet around them. Outside the window, the last of the light was going over the hills, the long, slow western going that happened in spring, the sky doing its complicated business of purple and orange, and the particular blue that came just before dark. She looked at him across the table. The papers between them, the tea he'd made her, the way he was chewing the inside of his cheek, slightly, working through the numbers. This was the life. Not the idea of it, not the version she'd tried to want when she was 28 and trying to be sensible about things. The good practical life, the well-organized life, the life that made sense on paper. This, the imperfect daily accumulation of choosing the same person again, not because it was easy, but because it was true, and because the morning after an argument, they both came back to the table and sat down and kept going. She thought about what she would tell someone if someone asked her what she'd learned from the last year. She had thought about this before and come at it from different angles, and the thing she kept arriving at was the same thing, stated different ways. You do not find out what you are worth by waiting for someone to tell you. You find it out by making choices and living in them. She had kept her store running for 6 years alone and paid off debt and extended credit and managed accounts and done it all without asking for acknowledgement, and she had been valued for it, genuinely, concretely valued, by every person who'd ever walked through her door with a problem she could solve. She had had worth the whole time. The question had never been whether she had it. The question had been whether she believed it enough to act from it rather than from the fear that she didn't. Turning down Walter Grayson hadn't been brave, exactly. It had been honest. She had known what she wanted, and she had refused to settle for the version of a life that didn't include it, even when the version on offer was good and reasonable and would have treated her fairly. Bravery would have been choosing it in the face of fear. What she had done was simpler than that. She had looked at what was in front of her and told the truth about it. The telling of the truth had been the thing. Not a grand truth, not a public declaration, not anything dramatic. Just, I want more than this. I know what the more is. I am not willing to pretend otherwise. She picked up her pen. She found her place in the column. She started adding. Across the table, Jonah looked up. He caught her looking. She didn't look away, and neither did he. And after a moment, he said, Creek project came in under budget. By how much? $43. That goes back into the land improvement account. I know. He held her eyes for a second longer. You want more tea? I'm fine. Okay. He went back to his papers. She went back to her numbers. Outside, the last light left the hills, and the dark came down soft and complete over the 40 acres, and the mended creek, and the roof that had survived the winter. And inside, the lamp burned steady on the table between two people doing the ordinary, unglamorous, daily work of a life they had chosen. She had spent years believing that being chosen was the thing, that the moment someone picked her, really picked her, would be the moment she arrived somewhere. What she knew now was different and simpler and harder to hold. She had needed to pick herself first. Everything else, Jonah, the ranch, the quiet evenings, the arguments, and the coming back from them, All of it had become possible only after she had sat in the dark at 2 in the morning with a piece of paper and been honest about what she wanted, and decided that wanting it was enough of a reason to go after it. Nobody gave her that. She had always had it. She just had to stop waiting for permission to use it. The lamp burned. The numbers added up. Jonah turned a page. Somewhere outside, one of the horses made a sound and then went quiet, and the April night settled over Dust Creek and the hills beyond it and the small ranch at the end of the road where nothing was perfect and everything was real. It was, Lila Harper Pike decided, exactly enough.